Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the CLEanagers podcast. Today, we're joined with the director of Press Forward, Ms. Dale Anglin. My name is Anthony, and my first question: can you start by telling us about Press Forward, what they do, and what's your initiative as the director?
Sure. So Press Forward is about a year old. It's a group of foundations all around the country. Now we're up to almost 70 or 80 foundations. And they are trying to address the issue of the demise of local news. So in many places around the country, because of all sorts of reasons, advertising dollars have changed. A number of our local newspapers have closed or are closing. The news industry is changing, it's going online. And so this effort has raised $500 million for the next 5 years to put out in the community to support, bolster, create new local news, help people adjust to the new digital age, all sorts of things. We can talk more about the details, but the bottom line is supposed to bring awareness about the need for local news and raise money to support local news.
And what brought you to Press Forward?
So I have worked in philanthropy for foundations for quite a while now. And even though I worked mostly in the past on children and family issues, one of the things I ended up doing was doing grants in the journalism space. But it wasn't because I cared so much about journalism. It was because I cared about young people and their families, and I wanted them to have proper information about what was changing in their community. And so I gave several grants over several years to to support news focused on young people and education, and ended up here in Cleveland for the last 5 years helping create a number of new, mostly online news sources. So we have now in the state of Ohio, we have something called Buckeye Flame, and it is the only statewide news source in Ohio focused on the LGBTQ population. We helped fund that and create that. There's something in Ohio now called Signal. It's 2 years old, and it is a local news source also, but it's statewide. So there's a chapter here in Cleveland, so Signal Cleveland. There's now one in Akron. There's now one in Cincinnati, and we've now got Columbus, the State House, and we're going to be expanding across other parts of the state. But it's online only, all digital, and so I helped fund that and create that. And out of that, I got the bug for journalism and how important local news is for our safety, for us being connected as community. And so when this position came up about 8 or 9 months ago, I applied and got it. So I've been on the job since March, and we can talk about the job. It's amazing, a lot of work, but I love it.
How does social media affect your initiative? Does it affect it positively or negatively?
You know, all new technology is in one way neutral, but you have to adjust to it, right? And so I would say social media is a newer form of getting information out. It's a new way for not just traditional journalists to report news and to report on things that are important to them. And traditional news has had to adjust to social media. And so, for example, Signal has been doing short form video. We've got examples around the country of people getting out news through WhatsApp, through Instagram. They're trying to embrace that new social media, right, and figure out, because the bottom line is you can't write stories locally the way you wrote them 10 years ago and just expect people to come. Now with social media, things get pushed out to you, right? And you're used to personalities and certain types of people. And I would just say local newspapers and online news sources are trying to figure out ways to adjust to that new social media. We're trying, in fact, within Press Forward, to help them do that faster, right? So if you've got an idea of how to change to become a digital outlet, how to do things on Instagram, we encourage our funders to support that.
What do you think is the main obstacle stopping local news from thriving in some areas?
Yeah. There's several obstacles. One is definitely, we all had a lot of local news. There were, in most cities, even in rural areas, there were sometimes 2 or 3 newspapers, right, often print. And they were able to do that because they sold ads. And so that advertising revenue really bolstered and supported most of the local news in the country. And in the last 20 years, between Facebook and Google and the social media, the ad revenue has moved to different platforms. But it's not just the ad revenue. what audiences demand of news has also changed. Literally, our habits have changed over the last 20 years. We're just used to getting news in so many different ways, especially young people. You guys don't even read many newspapers anymore, right? My son used to get news through BuzzFeed, but he was up on the news more than I was sometimes, right? I tell our adults, it's not that young people, they're just not consuming the news the way you did. They're just consuming it in another way. And so newspapers, be they digital or online, have to adjust to a changing audience. So the combination of audience change, ad revenue changing, tech changing, right? Even tech platforms and how you support news has changed. All of that combined has created almost like a perfect storm for traditional local news to have to say, oh, I've got to change. But how to change, at what pace, is very difficult. And we have, in fact, in the last 10 or 15 years, lost thousands of newspapers. We've lost over 40,000 newspaper jobs. And so it's a real crisis. And I want to say why it's so important for us to keep local news, because some people say, well, you just go to national news and just have TikTok. And I said, that's all great, and I'm all for all of that. And it turns out, and there's a lot of research on this, it turns out when you don't have local news, like just in your town, there is less cohesion in the town. There is no one, frankly, to watch elected officials. And even things like budgets go up, because it's government budgets, because no one's minding the store, no one's watching them. There's a lot more attention on the national news, which creates more polarization. So it turns out, actually, we all talk now about people aren't talking to each other. It turns out local news is one of the antidotes to getting people to talk to each other, to get community to understand each other better. So that's one of the reasons we're so focused on local news.
As it stands right now, what do you think is the most effective way to spread accurate news to people?
Yeah, there's multiple ways, and there are many examples right now of local news doing a good job of factual information, producing it in a way that people want it, not sometimes daily, sometimes weekly. But there's also, on the other side, there's work being done on how to help young people consume the news, because some of us have they've taken things like civics and stuff out of schools as much, right? So they don't teach you how to look at news, how to evaluate sources and things like that. So I would just say we're working on the demand side. How do you provide information to people in a way that they want it and that's factual? And also we're trying to work on the supply side, on the supply side, and then also on the demand side of how do people consume that news, and how do we teach them to be able to distinguish among so much information that we're all getting. Because usually you need to check more. You need more than one source if you hear something. It's a lot of work. It's a really complicated problem, to be honest. Very complicated. Can I talk about how we're structured?
Sure. Yeah.
So we believe that it's really important for local communities to address this locally, even though there are national foundations that are helping fund this. Of the 80-something foundations that are members of us, more than 40 are local foundations, and they just care about their city or their county or their state. And so we've started something called chapters, Press Forward chapters. We have 31 chapters now in 26 states. And what we say is, the mantra is that national can't tell local what to do. So we encourage those chapters. They are a mixture of community foundations, other types of foundations, partners like universities or libraries, outlets themselves, coming together in their region to first do some research on what are the outlets that exist right now in our region, what, frankly, communities were maybe never served well by the existing newspapers, because that's always been the case. There's always some group that's been left out. And how can we as a region raise money and support the outlets that are there, and create new outlets if we want to do that. If we think like there's something missing for this particular community and we need something for that community. So those chapters are literally, they just started this year, and we're probably going to have a lot more, but we're really trying to get them to think locally about what do you have now, what would you like to have to support the people in your community, and how can you raise money and support being able to grow what you have or create something new if you think it's needed.
What do you think is the best way to support young news broadcasters and people who want to get into journalism, want to get into news, what's the best way to support them and encourage them?
Yes, I for a long time worked on children and family and education. I worked a lot on after-school programs, and so I'm a big believer that young people need lots of exposure to lots of different things as they're growing up, and to help them figure out what path they would like to take in life. And I'm also a firm believer that young people need exposure, and you need to kind of practice things along the way. And what I've learned, frankly, in the journalism space is, to me, journalism, if you're working on a student newspaper in high school or college, is a great training mechanism, even if you don't want to be a journalist, because it teaches you how to ask questions. It teaches you persistence, because sometimes people don't want to answer your questions. It teaches you how to talk to people you don't normally know, right? It helps encourage you to be curious about the world. It teaches you failure, because sometimes you write things and it's like, no, that's not really what we want. It's a great avenue to expose young people to current events. And so I actually would love it if we could have many more both in-school opportunities for young people to practice journalism in some way, shape, or form, and out-of-school examples. Because even if you don't become a journalist, you can use all those skill sets for other things that you want to do. Every single job you're going to pursue wants you to be curious. They want you to know how to write. They want you to know how to talk to all types of people. It's incredible training. So that's one thing I'll say. I love journalism programs. And in fact, in Press Forward, we're going to be starting some work in 2025. A bunch of our funders focus on young people. And so we're going to be starting a committee just to focus on youth journalism. What exists right now? Could we encourage more to happen? How do we understand what currently is available to young people around the country? And then how do we understand how you all consume news? How do we train up our older journalists to understand that they may need to change, whatever. But I will say, advice I give to young people who think they want to pursue this is just know that this is a changing field. It's not an easy field to be in, because it's not sometimes just a clear path. But because it's changing, in some ways, you can move up faster if you choose to stay in the journalism field, because you used to have to go to small markets and then eventually go to the New York Times. But now, actually, some of those bigger papers will hire younger people quicker, because frankly, they want younger people, because that's the audience that they're going for sometimes. You're often, just easier to train up. And so, but just don't be open to lots of opportunities, because it may not be a traditional journalism path. You may not just go to this newspaper and then that newspaper. You have communication skills. And so there's sometimes companies, nonprofits, government, who would love to have those skills. So I see people going in and out of different types of jobs if they've been a journalism major in college. They may go do a communications job at a nonprofit or at government, and then they switch back into journalism. They may switch from print or digital to online. Just be open, I think, to those types of changes. But I just want you to know this: the skill sets you gain from working in journalism are the skill sets that employers want. You just have to figure out a way to market it in a way for that particular area that you're applying to.
I noticed you brought a few things over here.
I did. Yeah, I brought props. So one of the things we're learning, I'll say this, one of the reasons we wanted to form this collaborative is because in the past, foundations and philanthropy did not have to support journalism. It had its own revenue through those through advertising, right? So if you are an outlet right now and you go and apply to a foundation to get a grant, many of those foundations are not used to funding outlets, so they don't know how to judge them. They don't know that you can't, the foundation, if they give you a grant, they can't influence what you say, right? It's still got to be, an editorial wall. And so we are spending a lot of time training up foundations on understanding that we need you in this issue, we need you to fund in this area. And when you do, here are ways to do that. So we've hired writers, and we're coming up with lots of toolkits. We've been having several convenings of all our different funders. So we ask all of our chapters to start with doing some research. So we did a toolkit on how do you do that research? How do you do ecosystem research? What are you looking for? Do you use a university professor to help you do it? Do you hire a consultant? Can you do it yourself? Because people haven't all done this. The one thing we tell foundations, if you're going to get into this is not about supporting just one outlet. There may be one outlet that you really like, but usually, in most cases, that outlet is not the only thing that's needed in that community. So this is one of those, the ecosystem research. We also did a huge book. We had a convening here in Cleveland, actually, a few weeks ago. This is a whole workbook for the chapters to kind of understand what they're getting themselves into. Who are the partners that you would like around the table? How do you judge those partners? How do you even work with those partners? All sorts of things. And then lastly, actually two more things. The chapters, there's something called collective impact. It's a whole thing when people come together in a community to try to address common problems. And there's ways you do that collective impact. And that's really what Press Forward is collective impact. It's a bunch of partners working together to solve a common problem. When you do that, though, you need somebody kind of keeping the group together, right? We call it a backbone group. And so we have examples on how you structure chapters. So do you hire a consultant? Do you have somebody on your staff support you? How often do you have meetings? That kind of stuff. We don't want to bombard people. And then I just have an example. We have some of our chapters that are further along than others, and they've already done some of this work. So I was in Wyoming 2 weeks ago speaking to the business community. They've put together a news collaborative with a bunch of partners, and they've already produced their first ecosystem map and research. And it's wonderful. And one of the things, by the way, it says a lot of things, is Wyoming needs to focus a lot more on young people, and they need to focus on getting young people interested in journalism and supporting them. And they have a lot of young people who they think would be interested, but everybody's school systems and others have to focus on that.
Yeah, I feel like that's a universal thing. Every state or even worldwide,
yes,
they need to focus more on youth news and getting them and bringing them up.
So I'll give you an example of one of my favorite grants this year, and I know it's going to yield lots of dividends. We have people have been doing research now for years on the different aspects of the problem within journalism. And in some of the places where we've lost outlets or there are no outlets left, we have over, I think it's like 1,300 counties in the United States. That's a lot, 1,300, where there is either no outlet left or there's barely an outlet, it's like barely hanging on. But all of those counties have either a college or a university, either in them directly or adjacent to them. So there's a college in Vermont called the University of Vermont. And instead of what some schools do is they create journalism programs and journalism schools, and those are kind of expensive, to be honest. Not every school can afford to create those. What they did is they just created basically journalism classes and kind of programs in their kind of after school space. So you don't have to be a journalism major at the University of Vermont to do journalism. You can just decide you want to do that class or you want to do that after school activity. And it turned out that worked really well because there were a lot of students who didn't necessarily want to be journalists, but they wanted that exposure and that idea to just try it. Mm-hmm. So they have started in the University of Vermont reporting on the city that they are in, not just about their college. And in fact, they have created they have really supported that community because they had lost most of their newspapers. So they showed that you can just do this in your College of Liberal Arts. You don't have to create a whole big journalism school and get it endowed and all these other things. It's a much, frankly, quicker and easier way to do it and cheaper. So they were given a lot of money by one of our big foundations, the Knight Foundation, to replicate what they are doing in Vermont all across the country. So for the next 2 to 3 years, they're going to be working with something like 200 colleges around the country to get them to do the same thing. Just create smaller journalism it doesn't even have to be a major, but opportunities at your college, but make sure you're not just reporting on your college. That's one thing, but you also need to be reporting on the community and helping the community understand what's happening in their community. I really love that. I think you could do a lot with that. I think in journalism, we just have to figure out where our assets are, and our colleges and universities are assets. And so that's going to be an example of how we just regroup and come up with new ways to do journalism. That's, I think, going to be incredibly exciting. And I want to give an example. We have given grants now to a bunch of smaller outlets under $1 million. We gave it about over 200 grants about a month ago. And some of those were college newsrooms. Mm-hmm. And there's an example in Florida, for example, where the college newsroom did a series of articles on their president of their university. He ended up leaving because he had done a whole lot of things in the administration. You could look it up. He had added people in, paid them a lot of money, more than what you normally pay, wasn't really paying attention to the college. There were just some egregious things that were pretty clear that he did. But frankly, none of the other newspapers around were reporting on it. But the college students were like, wait a minute, this isn't right. And they FOIA'd and they got information on how much people were making. And after less than 2 years, he resigned.
Wow.
So I'm just saying, college students can make incredible impact. And so we're hoping that we can figure out ways to bolster that around the country. One of the things that we're doing.
You touched earlier on how local news brings unity to a community. Could you expand a little more on that?
Yeah, it's great. So I get to travel a lot in this job, and my favorite part of the travel is getting into community. I was in Oxford, Mississippi this summer. I was in Burlington, Vermont. This past week I was in Dubuque, Iowa. Last week I was in Laramie, Wyoming. And these are a mixture of towns, what people would call red, blue, and purple. Some tiny, 20,000, up to more. And it turns out that everybody wants the same thing. It does not matter your color, your age, your income bracket. You want to know in your community what's happening with the schools. You want to know what's happening with your elected officials and how are they doing. You need information about anything happening around safety and security, like around emergencies. So we have an example in Springfield, Illinois. This is true. A few years ago, they had a flood. There was no news left there. And there was no one to tell them what to do in that flood. After that, the community said, okay, and then luckily someone gave them some money. They said, we need a newspaper here, right? If nothing else, for safety and security. It turns out when we have local news, we have more information that we can understand our neighbors. And we like that. There's a reason we're living in that community, right? And when we focus on local, it equips us to understand our community better. And we don't only focus on the national polarizing news. We've even had examples of local newspapers that said for like a month, we're not going to report on anything national. We're just going to report on local. And everybody loved it because that's what we used to have. We used to have a mixture of both. And there's just lots of research that talks about how we all want that information. And so we're figuring out ways. You can see that just in the last few elections, right? We feel like people aren't talking to each other. Yeah. The vehicle to do that is local news. It doesn't have to be print. It could be digital. It could be Instagram. There's lots of ways to do it. By the way, some of those things are for-profit and nonprofit. That's okay. There's tax statuses. But it really does turn out that people, they like their local news. We need it, right? We just got to figure out a way to get it back.
What do you think is one of the immediate changes that need to be made in order to bring local news up?
Ooh, there's lots of immediate needs. Well, I would just say one thing that we're realizing as we go out and talk to a lot of people is if I just go, I literally now, when I'm in a taxi or an Uber, I'm on the plane, people sometimes just ask me what I do, and I say, I raise money for local news. That's all I say. And everybody has a story for me about in their town what happened with their local news. It's not as robust as it used to be, or it's gone completely. And they all want it back. It's amazing to me. I love it. But it does beg the question when you do studies around the region, if you ask, they just did this in Chicago, if you ask people in Chicago, do they think local news has a problem? They don't think there is one because they just always had it. And they get other information. It's just not local, right? Mm-hmm. So we have a big awareness problem in local news. It's hard to solve a problem if people don't think it's a problem. So we're doing a lot of work over the next year or two around strategic communications to get people to understand how to distinguish local news from national and how to then think about what needs do you have around local news in your community, and then how can we all support it. So if you're in a community, of course, philanthropy is trying to do its part. We're also trying to get people, if you're in a community where you can support local news, I know people are used to getting information for free, but if you want local news, you need to support it a little bit. So we're telling everybody, if you can afford the $100 a year membership for that local news source, please do that, right? And we're showing a number of people who are able to do that. Not everybody can do it, but if you can, then you're subsidizing someone who can't, right? And then we're thinking about ways to continue people to help them train up about how to get advertising dollars, because you can still get advertising dollars. I'll give you an example. I was in Wyoming, and it turns out that governments and companies who advertise all the time, they sometimes have been advertising in the exact same places for 20 years. They don't change. It's the same big newspaper that's barely existing, but they still advertise there. So when I talked about, I bet you if you analyze that newspaper in your town, it's what we call a ghost newspaper. It's technically there, but it's almost a mirage because it doesn't really report on local news anymore. It just really aggregates from national. And the guy who was the head of one of the airports there got up and said, "Wow, I didn't know that. Could someone come and talk to us about that so we could do some analysis, and we are willing to make changes to our advertising budget. But we don't know how to do that, and we don't know we should do that, right? So there's a whole thing that around talking to the business community about where you advertise and what do you think you're getting from the advertisements. Not just Facebook, of course, advertise on Facebook, go ahead, but you also need local. There's just so many things that I think that are low-hanging fruit that we could do a better job of. So the business community, just regular residents, and telling them, I talk to a lot of regular people, and they all say to me, "Oh yeah, I need to go support that thing." It's just no one's asked them. We have to ask. So this is a big strategic communications job over the next couple of years as a start. That's one thing. And I will say one other thing is we got to get to young people. We've got to understand young people better. We've got to involve young people in this work. I want, in a year from now, so I'm saying it right out here out loud because I think y'all would be a great part, I want a youth working committee in Press Forward so that we can be not the adults, not the older adults, just saying do it this way. Let's experiment, with what young people think is needed in certain places. Because frankly, you're the future. It's not me. And if newspapers want to be around or print, digital, whatever, they've got to think about what you're going to need over the next 20 years. And so then you need to be a part of that conversation.
Besides donating to local newspapers, what are ways that individuals can help support their local news?
Yeah. So we were in Iowa this week with about 50 donors in Dubuque, Iowa. It's a fabulous community there. And what my colleague, and I was like, I'm going to have to do this more often. She deputized them. She says, now that you know that there's an issue with local news and you want to support it, we need you to help tell the story. So when you are talking to your colleagues or your friends or your family, just ask the question, how do you get your local news? And I bet you it will start a conversation. And say, do you support something? Would you be willing to support something? And I'll say one other thing. What we say always is most people don't just like local news, they care about a particular issue. So they care about the arts, or they care about kids, or they care about climate, or they care about housing, right? And they often in their philanthropy support those things. What we tell everybody is it does not matter what your first issue is, your second issue should be local news. Because even if you have all of those issues, if people don't know what's happening in that space, or they don't know what nonprofits are trying to do to help you, or governments are trying to do to help you, what's the point? If you don't have the information about what's happening, you can be trying to do all the strategies you want to solve a problem, but people won't know you're trying to solve it. And so oftentimes that's how we talk to people, is think about local news underlying everything else that you care about. And as you give money to the arts and the orchestra and to this kid program, make sure you're supporting your local news source. Now, it needs to be a quality local news source. Let me just be clear, not the pink slime. We want fact-based, all of that stuff. We want, good local news. But I tell people, can you all just think about it and talk about it with your friends and your family? That's kind of spread the word about how important this is. And I think that's really important. If this last election, people kept saying they didn't have enough information because they only got it from national, but they actually didn't get it from national. They got it from social media. Because only 11 million people read the New York Times. We have 370 million people in this country, so they're not all reading the New York Times. We have to have other ways of getting that information out, which is why I think that also it's incumbent on current news sources, be they digital or online, to adjust and add on social media stuff, right? You can't avoid where so many people are getting their news. You have to figure out how to adjust what you do and incorporate it.
Thank you so much, Dale, for coming out here. It was really insightful hearing about all the local news and how to support it, how to make it better. Thank you so much.
Thank you.